A little girl was found unconscious in the snow, abandoned by the one person who should have protected her. That night, on the outskirts of Montana, Staff Sergeant Daniel Brooks was finishing his patrol with his canine partner, Rex. Nothing unusual, just another cold, quiet shift. Then, Rex stopped. No command, no hesitation, just instinct pulling Daniel toward a dark, silent yard buried under snow. Daniel could have kept walking. Instead, he followed. And in that choice, guided not by orders but by something deeper, a life was saved and a family was born. Before we continue, tell me, where in the world are you watching from tonight? The storm rolled over the outskirts of Kalispell, Montana, erasing roads, houses, and sound beneath heavy snow and wind, leaving the night cold, narrow, and unforgiving. Daniel Brooks walked into it anyway. He moved with steady, measured steps along the poorly lit road that bordered the forest, his breath visible in short bursts as the wind cut through his winter jacket. He was a former U.S. Marine, recently transitioned out of active duty, still carrying himself with the quiet discipline of someone who had spent years learning how quickly the world could turn hostile. Nights like this reminded him too much of places he preferred not to revisit. But staying inside had been worse. Silence pressed too hard when he stopped moving. Beside him, Rex padded through the snow without hesitation. The German Shepherd was older now, his pace slower than it once had been, but his awareness had never dulled. Snow dusted his muzzle and ears as he scanned their surroundings, every sense tuned outward. Rex had served with Daniel overseas, trained to detect threats hidden beneath dirt and debris, and even now, far from any battlefield, his instincts remained sharp. Daniel trusted Rex more than he trusted his own restlessness. They had nearly reached the end of the street when Rex slowed. Not abruptly, not alarmed, just enough for Daniel to feel the shift through the leash. Daniel stopped and looked down. Rex stood still, body angled toward a yard on the right, ears forward, tail low. His posture was alert, but there was no aggression in it. No warning growl, no bark. Instead, Rex took a single step forward and then paused again, as if waiting for permission. Daniel followed his gaze. The yard was half buried beneath drifting snow, its fence crooked and partially collapsed. The house behind it was dark, windows black, the porch buried under white. Daniel felt a familiar tightening in his chest. This wasn't nothing. Rex never reacted like this without reason. "All right," Daniel murmured, loosening the leash slightly. Rex moved ahead with controlled urgency, pulling Daniel through the broken gate. Snow resisted every step now, deeper and uneven. Daniel's boot struck something solid, and he looked down instinctively. There was a shape in the snow. Small. Too small. Daniel dropped to one knee and brushed snow aside with gloved hands. Fabric appeared first, thin, soaked through, completely inadequate for the weather. His movements slowed, careful now, as the outline beneath the snow became unmistakable. A child. His breath caught, sharp and painful. She lay face down, unmoving, her body stiff with cold. Her jacket was light, the kind meant for early autumn, not a Montana winter night. Snow had already begun to collect along her back and shoulders, softening her outline as if the storm were trying to erase her. Rex reached her first. The dog lowered himself beside her, close but careful, his body curved protectively along her side. He made a low, quiet sound in his throat, not distress, not alarm, but something close to concern. It was a sound Daniel had only heard once or twice before, always when Rex recognized vulnerability. Daniel swallowed and gently rolled the child onto her side. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old. Her face was pale beneath the faint yellow glow of a distant streetlight, lips tinged blue from the cold. Her hair was tangled and stiff with frost, strands stuck to her cheek. Daniel noticed bruising along her jaw and temple, dark, uneven marks that didn't match the fall patterns he'd seen before. He forced himself not to linger. Focus first, questions later. He pressed 2 fingers to her neck. A pulse. Weak, uneven, but there. "She's alive," he whispered, the words grounding him. Daniel shrugged out of his jacket without hesitation and wrapped it around her small body,
tucking it tight to block the wind. Cold bit instantly into his arms and chest, sharp enough to sting, but he barely registered it. He lifted her carefully, surprised by how light she felt, how easily she fit against him. Her head lolled against his shoulder, unresponsive. Rex stayed close as Daniel turned back toward the road, matching his pace step for step, never breaking position. The dog's body brushed Daniel's leg occasionally, solid and reassuring.
Daniel fumbled for his phone with numb fingers and called emergency services. His voice shifted automatically into something calm and controlled, shaped by years of reporting under pressure. Location: child found unconscious. Severe cold exposure. Immediate assistance needed. As he waited, standing in the storm with the girl held tightly against his chest, Daniel felt something stir beneath the practiced calm. This wasn't a mission. No orders, no objective. But responsibility settled over him just the same. Sirens cut faintly through the wind several minutes later, distant but growing louder. Red and blue lights flickered against the falling snow as an ambulance pulled to the curb. Paramedics moved quickly, their movements efficient and practiced as they took the child from Daniel's arms and transferred her onto a stretcher. "How long was she out here?" one of them asked. "I don't know," Daniel answered honestly. "I just found her." They worked fast, checking vitals, shielding her from the cold, voices low and professional. Rex sat back on his haunches nearby, eyes fixed on the girl, ears twitching with every sound. He did not bark or move, only watched. As the ambulance doors closed and the vehicle pulled away, Daniel stood alone in the snow, his arms suddenly empty. The cold hit harder now, biting through his clothes. He barely noticed. Something about the way Rex had reacted still sat heavy in his chest. That wasn't fear. That was recognition. Daniel looked down at the dog. Rex lifted his head and met Daniel's gaze, amber eyes steady, unwavering. Daniel exhaled slowly. "Let's go," he said, though he wasn't sure where go really meant anymore. They didn't return home. Daniel followed the ambulance lights through the storm, his thoughts racing ahead to the hospital, to the questions he knew would come. He had no answers yet, just an image burned into his mind, a small body in the snow, abandoned to the cold. As they reached the hospital entrance, Daniel felt the unmistakable pull of something forming, something he couldn't yet name. Whatever had begun in that yard was not finished. Not even close. The emergency wing of Kalispell Regional Medical Center hummed with a sterile kind of urgency, a sharp contrast to the chaos of the storm outside. Fluorescent lights reflected off polished floors, the smell of disinfectant hanging heavy in the air, clean and unforgiving. Daniel Brooks stood just inside the automatic doors, snow melting off his boots into small, dark puddles, his hands still faintly trembling from the cold and from the way the night had shifted without warning. Rex sat beside him, leash loose, posture calm but attentive. The German shepherd's fur was damp along his back, darkened by melting snow, his breathing steady. He had been trained to wait, to hold position until given a signal. And now he did exactly that, eyes tracking every movement in the hallway. A nurse passing by slowed slightly when she noticed the dog, then Daniel, then the look on his face. She said nothing, only nodded once before moving on. The child, Emma, had been taken straight into trauma. Daniel had not followed immediately. Years of military conditioning had taught him when to step forward and when to stay out of the way. He stood back, gave the paramedic space, answered the few questions they asked, then waited. Waiting, however, had always been harder for him than action. Time stretched in strange ways inside hospitals. Minutes felt longer than hours ever had in the desert overseas. A doctor eventually approached him, flipping through a clipboard as she walked. She was in her early 40s, medium height, her dark hair pulled back into a practical bun streaked with silver at the temples. Her face was composed, professional, but there was a tension around her eyes that Daniel recognized immediately. It was the look of someone who had delivered bad news too many times. "Are you the one who found the child?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am," Daniel replied. His voice was even, though his jaw tightened without his permission. "I'm Dr. Elaine Carter," she said.
"She's alive, but her condition is serious." Daniel nodded once. He had expected that. Hope, when it came, was rarely gentle. "She's hypothermic," Dr. Carter continued, "and she's suffered multiple injuries. Some are recent, others are older." Daniel said nothing. "We've stabilized her for now," the doctor added, choosing her words carefully. "But she's in a coma. We don't know how long it will last." The words settled into Daniel's chest like weight. Coma. He had heard it before, whispered in field hospitals, spoken softly to families who stood where he stood now. "Is it an accident?" he asked, though he already knew the answer.
Dr. Carter met his eyes. "The injuries don't suggest that." She didn't elaborate, and she didn't need to. Daniel had seen enough in his life to recognize what she wasn't saying. As the doctor walked away, Daniel exhaled slowly, his breath leaving him in a controlled release. Rex shifted closer, his shoulder brushing Daniel's leg. The contact grounded him more than he expected. A woman approached next, clipboard held against her chest like a shield. She was tall and slim, perhaps in her mid-30s, with light brown skin and dark hair that fell in loose waves just past her shoulders. She wore a navy cardigan over a plain blouse, slacks creased neatly, practical shoes that suggested long days on her feet. Her posture was straight but not rigid, and her expression held a careful balance of professionalism and empathy. "Mr. Brooks?" she asked. "Yes." "My name is Sarah Mitchell," she said. "I'm a social worker assigned to this case." Daniel nodded again, a reflex now. Sarah glanced briefly at Rex, then back at Daniel. "Hospital policy doesn't usually allow animals in this area," she said gently. "But given the circumstances, we'll make an exception, for now." "Thank you," Daniel replied. He meant it more than he said. They moved a few steps away from the main corridor, stopping near a quiet alcove. Sarah spoke in a low voice, practiced but sincere. "The child's name is Emma Collins. She's 6 years old." Daniel absorbed the name. Emma. It made her real in a way she hadn't been yet. "She lives with her aunt," Sarah continued, "Marla Collins, her legal guardian." Daniel's jaw tightened. Sarah flipped a page on her clipboard. "We've had previous concerns regarding the household, reports of neglect, unstable living conditions." Daniel looked at her sharply. Then why was she still there? Sarah didn't flinch. "Because concern isn't the same as proof," she said quietly. "And the system moves slower than anyone wants it to." He said nothing. He didn't trust himself to. "Marla Collins has a documented gambling addiction," Sarah went on. "Periods of absence, financial instability. We're working with law enforcement now to locate her." Daniel pictured the yard again, the snow, the way Emma's body had barely registered against his arms. He clenched his hands, forcing them to relax. "What happens to the girl?" he asked. Sarah hesitated, just long enough for him to notice. "That depends on her recovery, and on what the investigation determines." "And until then?" "She remains in protective custody. Social services will be involved." Daniel nodded slowly. This was the point where most people stepped back, where they did what they were supposed to do, then left the rest to the system. He told himself he should do the same. But Rex hadn't moved. The dog sat just outside the trauma area doors now, gaze fixed forward, unblinking. Nurses passed around him. He didn't react. He simply waited. Daniel found himself returning to the hospital the next morning. And the morning after that. He sat beside Emma's bed when they allowed it, the room filled with the quiet rhythm of machines and soft beeping monitors. She lay still beneath white sheets, smaller somehow in the hospital bed than she had looked in his arms. Tubes and wires traced paths across her fragile frame. Her face bore faint discolorations, bruises fading into muted yellows and purples, less shocking now, but no less troubling. Daniel spoke to her anyway. He told her his name. He told her about the storm, about Rex, about the mountains surrounding Kalispell, and how they looked in the early morning light. He didn't know if she could hear him, Doctors said it was possible. He chose to believe them. Rex lay near the foot of the bed during these visits, head resting on his paws, ears flicking occasionally at unfamiliar sounds. He never approached the machines, never crossed invisible boundaries. He simply stayed. On the third day, Sarah found Daniel there again. "You don't have to keep coming," she said softly. Daniel didn't look away from the child. "I know." Sarah studied him for a moment. "Most people don't." He finally turned to face her. "Most people didn't find her in the snow." Sarah's expression shifted, not surprise, but understanding. Later that evening, after visiting hours ended, Daniel stood in the hallway outside Emma's room. Nurses moved past him with tired efficiency. Somewhere down the corridor, a child cried briefly, then fell silent. Daniel rested his forehead against the cool wall and closed his eyes. This wasn't his responsibility. That was the thought that kept circling back. And yet, every time he considered leaving, the image returned uninvited. The way Rex had stopped. The way the storm had seemed to pause around that yard. The weight of a life pressed against his chest. When Sarah approached him again, clipboard tucked under one arm, he was already bracing himself. "There's something we need to discuss," she said. Daniel straightened. "If Emma recovers," Sarah continued, "and if her aunt is deemed unfit, we'll need a temporary placement. Foster care. Possibly multiple homes." Daniel looked back through the small window in the door at the motionless child. Rex shifted at his side. "I'm not family," Daniel said. Sarah's voice was quiet but firm. "Family isn't always who steps forward first." The words followed him long after he left the hospital that night. Daniel walked back into the cold, Rex beside him, the storm finally easing into a quiet snowfall. For the first time since leaving the Marines, Daniel felt the familiar weight of an unchosen mission settle onto his shoulders. And he knew, with a clarity that left no room for doubt, that walking away was no longer an option. Daniel Brooks signed his name with deliberate strokes, the pen heavier than it had any right to be, as if the weight of the decision were pressing through the paper and into his hand. The social services office in Whitefish was quiet in the way government buildings often were, muted and practical, beige walls, framed notices about procedures and timelines. Sarah Mitchell stood across from him, watching closely without hovering. She looked tired today, her dark hair pulled back into a low ponytail instead of its usual loose waves. Faint shadows beneath her eyes, suggesting too many late nights and too many cases that didn't resolve cleanly. Still, her posture remained composed, her voice steady as she explained the final steps. "This is temporary custodial placement," she said, tapping the document lightly with her finger. "Medical guardianship while Emma remains incapacitated. You'll be subject to background checks, a home assessment, and periodic evaluations. If at any point this becomes unsafe or unsustainable, we reassess." Daniel nodded. He had listened to every word, asked the necessary questions, and offered no resistance. Military service had taught him the importance of procedure, and this felt like another kind of operation, one with no margin for error. His record, clean and thoroughly documented, had worked in his favor. Years in uniform, commendations, no criminal history. Stability, on paper at least. Rex lay at Daniel's feet, head resting on his paws, eyes half closed but alert. He had accompanied Daniel into the office without fuss, sitting quietly through the conversation as if he understood the gravity of the moment. Sarah had noticed. She always noticed. "You understand," she said carefully, "that this isn't a promise of permanence." Daniel met her gaze. "I understand." What he didn't say was that he had already stopped thinking in temporary terms. The transition happened faster than he expected. Emma was still unconscious when they brought her from the hospital, her condition stable enough for supervised discharge under medical guidance. A nurse accompanied them, efficient and kind, offering instructions in a calm voice. Daniel listened, absorbing details about medication schedules, warning signs, and follow-up appointments. He repeated everything back once, twice, until the nurse nodded in quiet approval.
Whitefish was quieter than Kalispell, its streets narrower, edged with snowbanks that reflected the pale winter sun.
Daniel's house sat at the end of a short cul-de-sac, modest and functional, a single-story structure with a small fenced yard out back. It had never been meant for more than one man and one dog, until now. Inside, the house was exactly what it had always been: clean, orderly, sparse. A couch positioned with precision, a dining table that rarely saw use, boots lined up near the door, tools organized in the garage with near military symmetry. The air carried faint traces of coffee and motor oil. No bright colors, no soft edges. Daniel hesitated just inside the doorway as the nurse helped settle Emma onto the couch, adjusting pillows and blankets with practiced ease. Emma looked impossibly small there, her body dwarfed by the furniture, her breathing shallow but steady. Medical supplies sat neatly arranged on the coffee table, a temporary intrusion into Daniel's controlled environment. Rex approached first, moving slowly, deliberately. He sniffed the air near Emma, then lowered himself beside the couch, his body positioned so that his flank touched the edge, creating a quiet barrier between her and the rest of the room. His ears twitched, but he didn't move away. Daniel watched him, feeling a strange sense of reassurance. Rex had accepted her presence without question. The nurse offered final instructions, her voice gentle but firm. She may respond to familiar voices, even small movements matter. If you notice anything at all, call immediately. Daniel thanked her, his voice steady, and watched as she left. The door closed softly behind her, and the house fell into an unfamiliar silence. It felt different now. Daniel stood there for a long moment, hands at his sides, unsure of what to do next. He had planned missions in hostile terrain, coordinated logistics under fire, made decisions that affected lives. None of that prepared him for this. For the sight of a child sleeping on his couch, for the responsibility that came with it. He started with what he knew: routine. Medication times were written down, double-checked. Water within reach. The thermostat adjusted upward. He moved through the house methodically, gathering spare blankets, placing them carefully around Emma, ensuring nothing obstructed her breathing. Each action grounded him, gave him something to focus on. Rex never left her side. That night, Daniel slept on the floor near the couch, wrapped in a spare blanket, his back stiff and his mind restless. He woke at every small sound, every shift in Emma's breathing, every movement from Rex. The dog would lift his head, listen, then settle again. Daniel followed his lead. Days passed in a quiet rhythm. Daniel coordinated with Sarah daily, answering questions, submitting to checks without complaint. A caseworker visited, a middle-aged man with a thinning hairline and a clipboard who walked through the house with professional detachment, noting exits, space, safety. He asked simple questions, received simple answers. He observed Rex with mild curiosity, but made no comment. Emma did not wake. Daniel talked to her anyway. He sat beside her in the evenings, reading from a children's book Sarah had brought over on her second visit. She had stood awkwardly in the doorway that day, coat still on, holding the thin paperback like an offering. "It might help," she had said. "Some patients respond to familiar patterns, voices, stories." Daniel hadn't questioned it. He read aloud in a low voice, stumbling over animated dialogue, his tone serious even when the story wasn't. He told Emma about the mountains, about the way snow fell differently in Whitefish than it had where he grew up. He talked about Rex, about how the dog hated thunderstorms but tolerated fireworks, how he always knew when Daniel's nightmares were about to surface. Rex lay nearby, his presence constant. On the fourth night, as Daniel turned a page mid-sentence, something changed. It was subtle, so subtle he almost missed it. Emma's fingers twitched. Daniel froze, his breath catching painfully in his chest. He watched, afraid to move, afraid to hope. A moment passed, then another. Her hand shifted again, just slightly, the movement uncertain but undeniable. "Emma?" he whispered, leaning forward. Rex lifted his head, ears forward, body tensing without aggression, his eyes fixed on Emma's hand. Daniel set the book aside and reached out slowly,
carefully, his fingers hovering just above hers before making contact. Her skin was warm, alive. Her fingers curled faintly against his. He swallowed hard, emotion rising unexpectedly, sharp and disorienting. He had learned to control fear. He had learned to suppress grief. This fragile hope was something else entirely. "Hey," he murmured, his voice unsteady despite his effort. "You're okay. You're safe." Emma didn't open her eyes, but her breathing changed, deepening slightly, her brow creasing as if responding to a distant sound. Daniel stayed like that for a long time, holding her hand, afraid that any movement might break the moment. Rex settled again, positioning himself closer, his body a quiet anchor. Later, when Daniel called Sarah to report what he'd seen, she listened carefully, her voice cautious but hopeful. "That's a good sign," she said. "It doesn't mean she'll wake immediately, but it matters. You did the right thing calling." After the call ended, Daniel sat alone in the dim light of the living room, Emma sleeping peacefully, Rex watching over her. He felt exhaustion settle into his bones, but beneath it was something else. A shift, a sense of purpose that felt both terrifying and grounding. This house had never known a child. It had been built around order, around solitude, around survival. Now, something new had taken root. Daniel leaned back against the couch, eyes heavy but alert, aware that nothing about this was temporary in the ways that mattered. Whatever happened next, whatever complications, challenges, or consequences waited beyond this quiet night, he knew he had crossed a line he could not uncross. And for the first time, that knowledge didn't feel like a burden. It felt like home. The Flathead County Courthouse stood heavy and unmoved beneath a pale winter sky, its stone facade cold and indifferent, as if it had witnessed too many versions of truth to care which one walked through its doors today. Daniel Brooks felt that weight the moment he stepped inside. He wore a dark, simple jacket instead of his old Marine coat, his posture straight but restrained, the way it always became when he entered spaces ruled by authority rather than instinct. His jaw was clean-shaven, the sharp angles of his face more visible now, lines etched deeper around his mouth from weeks of interrupted sleep and quiet strain. Rex was not with him inside the courtroom. Court rules didn't allow it. But Daniel felt the absence like a missing limb. Emma stood close to him, her small fingers hooked tightly into his hand. She had woken fully 2 days earlier. Not all at once. First her eyes, unfocused and frightened. Then her voice, thin and uncertain. The doctor said her recovery would be uneven, that trauma didn't fade simply because consciousness returned. Daniel had believed them, but nothing prepared him for how fragile she felt now in public spaces, how her body tensed at sudden sounds, how her eyes scanned rooms for exits. Sarah Mitchell met them near the courtroom entrance. She looked more formal than usual today, navy blazer fitted neatly over her slender frame, dark hair pulled into a smooth, low bun that exposed her sharp cheekbones and tired eyes. Her skin carried the faint pallor of someone who spent more time under fluorescent lights than sunlight. She knelt briefly to Emma's level, offering a soft smile. "You're doing great," Sarah said quietly. "I'll be right here." Emma nodded but didn't let go of Daniel's hand. Then Marla Collins walked in. She arrived late, heels clicking too loudly against the courthouse floor, her presence announcing itself before she spoke a word. Marla was in her late 30s, tall and thin to the point of sharpness, her blonde hair bleached and styled carefully, makeup heavy enough to hide exhaustion, but not desperation. Her eyes were quick, restless, darting between people as if measuring who might be useful. She stopped when she saw Emma. For a fraction of a second, something flickered across her face, surprise, perhaps irritation, but it vanished beneath a practiced expression of wounded concern. "There she is," Marla said, her voice rising. "My niece." Emma stiffened. Daniel felt it instantly, the way her grip tightened, the way her body pressed closer to his leg. He stepped slightly in front of her without thinking, a reflex carved deep by years of training. "That man kidnapped her," Marla continued, pointing directly at Daniel. "Took her from my custody while I was trying to get help." The words landed hard in the room. Daniel said nothing. Sarah did. "That's not accurate," she stated calmly, stepping forward. "Mr. Brooks followed emergency and social service protocols." Marla laughed sharply. "Of course you'd say that. You people never listen to family." The judge entered before the argument could escalate further. The courtroom settled into tense silence as proceedings began. The judge, a gray-haired woman with deep-set eyes and an unreadable expression, listened as Marla's attorney spoke first. He painted Marla as a woman who had struggled, yes, but who had recognized her mistakes and sought treatment.
He referenced a short-term rehabilitation program, certificates printed on glossy paper, carefully chosen words like recovery and second chance. Daniel watched Emma as they spoke. She stared at the floor, her shoulders hunched inward, breathing shallow. When Marla's voice cut in, emotional, practiced, Emma flinched. "I love her," Marla said, pressing a hand dramatically to her chest. "She's all I have. I had a relapse, yes, but I've completed treatment. I deserve my family back." The judge nodded slowly. Then Sarah spoke. She presented the medical records first. Clear documentation of repeated injuries. Timelines that didn't match Marla's explanations. Photographs that made the room uncomfortably quiet. A police officer testified next, confirming ongoing investigations and prior welfare checks. Daniel was called to the stand. He answered every question plainly. No embellishment, no anger. He spoke of finding Emma in the snow, of calling emergency services, of following instructions. When asked why he continued to care for her, he paused. "Because she needed someone to stay," he said simply. The judge leaned back, hands folded. After a recess that felt endless, the ruling came. Temporary custody would be returned to the biological guardian, Marla Collins, pending further review. The words echoed in Daniel's ears, hollow and wrong. Emma looked up, confusion breaking into fear. "No," she whispered. Marla smiled, relief sharp and triumphant. Court officers approached. Emma moved first. She turned suddenly, wrapping both arms around Daniel's waist, burying her face into his jacket with a sob that cut through the room. "Daddy," she cried, "please don't make me go." The word hit Daniel like impact. He froze, one hand hovering, then closing around her shoulders as carefully as if she might shatter. The courtroom murmured. The judge's expression shifted, just slightly. Daniel lowered his head, his voice barely steady. "I'm right here." But the ruling stood. Later, outside the courthouse, the sky had darkened, clouds pressing low. Daniel knelt in front of Emma, forcing himself to meet her eyes. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "I promise." Marla watched from a distance, arms crossed, satisfaction thinly veiled. That night, Daniel didn't sleep. He worked. He gathered medical reports, requested official copies. Sarah connected him with neighbors who had called welfare checks, a middle-aged couple who described seeing Emma alone for hours, sometimes days. A local doctor agreed to testify. A canine behavioral specialist documented Rex's responses, confirming the dog's protective, non-aggressive reaction as consistent with recognizing a vulnerable, non-threatening individual. Daniel requested his full military file, commendations, psychological evaluations, discharge assessments. He submitted to another mental health screening without hesitation. Word spread quietly. Neighbors wrote statements. A nurse volunteered testimony. A former Marine colleague agreed to speak about Daniel's character. He didn't ask for loyalty. He earned it by staying. The fight was no longer about winning. It was about proof. And Daniel Brooks wasn't done. 1 year later, the Kalispell courthouse felt less like a battlefield and more like a place where truths finally came to rest. Daniel Brooks stood near the wooden bench, hands loosely folded, shoulders squared out of habit rather than tension. He had worn the same posture into briefing rooms and evacuation zones, but today there was no operation to execute, no orders to follow, only a verdict that would decide the shape of the rest of his life. Emma sat beside him, her small legs swinging slowly, heels tapping the bench in a quiet rhythm she didn't seem aware of. She had grown in that year, not just in height, but in the way she occupied space. Her back was straighter now. Her eyes, though still cautious,
no longer darted constantly. She leaned against Daniel's arm without thinking, her fingers occasionally hooking into the sleeve of his jacket as if checking that he was still there.
Daniel felt every one of those small movements. He told himself he was calm. He had faced worse moments than this, moments when lives were lost in seconds, when decisions carried irreversible weight. But this was different. Those moments had trained him to expect loss. This one dared him to hope. Sarah Mitchell sat at the front table, files aligned neatly. She looked older than she had a year ago, though not in a way that suggested defeat. Her dark hair, once always pulled back tightly, now rested just above her shoulders, softening the sharp lines of her face. Her skin carried the tired pallor of someone who had spent too many nights arguing with systems that moved too slowly. Still, there was a steadiness to her posture, a quiet certainty. She believed in this case. That belief mattered more than she knew. Across the aisle sat Marla Collins. Daniel did not look at her at first. When he finally did, it was with the distant clarity of someone observing a past threat rather than a present one. Marla looked diminished, though she tried to mask it with rigid posture and carefully chosen clothing. Her blonde hair was pulled back severely, revealing a face that had lost its practiced confidence. Her eyes were sharp but unfocused, restless in a way Daniel recognized all too well. He had seen that look in men who were fighting battles they hadn't yet admitted to losing. Emma noticed her before Daniel did. Her body stiffened instantly. Daniel felt it, the subtle change in her breathing, the way her hand tightened around his sleeve. Without drawing attention, he shifted slightly closer, his arm forming a quiet barrier. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Presence was enough. The judge entered, and the room rose. The proceedings unfolded with procedural restraint. Evidence already known was summarized, conclusions drawn from months of documentation and testimony. Daniel listened, but his attention kept drifting back to Emma, to the way her foot bounced once, then stilled when he placed his hand gently over her knee, to the way she held herself together with effort rather than ease. When the judge finally spoke the words, "permanent custody granted to Daniel Brooks," Daniel didn't react at first. He felt it, a sudden loosening in his chest, a release so unfamiliar it almost frightened him. He had spent a lifetime bracing for impact, not relief. Emma turned toward him slowly, eyes wide, searching his face for confirmation. "Does that mean I stay?" she whispered. Daniel knelt in front of her, the polished courtroom floor cold beneath his knee. He placed his hands on her shoulders, grounding himself as much as her. "Yes," he said quietly. "You stay. You're home." Her breath hitched. Then she moved, arms wrapping around his neck with fierce urgency, her face pressed into his shoulder as if afraid the moment might vanish if she let go. "I knew it," she said, her voice muffled but certain. "I knew you wouldn't leave." Daniel closed his eyes. For a brief second, the world narrowed to the weight of her arms, the warmth of her breath, the steady truth of her trust. He had sworn oaths before. None had felt as binding as this. Outside the courthouse, spring sunlight cut through the lingering chill. Snow still clung to the distant mountains, but the ground beneath their feet was bare, damp with thaw. Daniel walked with Emma down the steps, her hand in his, her steps lighter than he had ever seen them. Rex waited by the truck. The German shepherd rose slowly, age visible now in the gray along his muzzle and the careful stiffness of his movements. But his eyes were clear, alert, tracking Emma the moment she came into view. His tail wagged once, controlled, deliberate, before he lowered his head to her level. Emma dropped to her knees in front of him, burying her face into his thick amber fur. "We did it," she whispered. Rex responded with a low, contented huff, pressing his weight gently against her as if sealing the promise. Life did not soften overnight. Emma's nightmares still came, though they no longer consumed entire nights. When they did, Rex lay beneath her bed, his presence steady and wordless. Daniel learned to wake without panic, to sit beside her and wait without rushing her back to sleep. He learned that reassurance was not always spoken.
He learned to listen.
School brought new challenges, classrooms full of noise, curious children, questions that Emma sometimes wasn't ready to answer. Daniel attended every meeting, sat through every discussion, absorbing information the way he once absorbed mission briefings. He learned the language of teachers and counselors, of developmental milestones and trauma responses. He learned that progress was rarely linear. Emma learned too. She learned that fear did not mean danger, that adults could be consistent, that anger did not always follow mistakes. She learned how to laugh again, tentatively at first, then with abandon. Daniel noticed the first time she laughed without immediately checking his reaction. He turned away so she wouldn't see his eyes sting. One afternoon, months later, Daniel stood on the back porch, a mug of coffee cooling forgotten in his hand. Emma ran across the yard, barefoot, her laughter sharp and clear as she chased Rex. The dog moved at a careful trot, letting her think she was winning, then darting just out of reach. His amber coat caught the sunlight, the black saddle along his back stark against the gold. Daniel leaned against the railing. This house no longer felt like a place he passed through between missions. Chalk drawings covered the concrete steps. Wind chimes clinked softly in the breeze, Emma's addition, because she said they made the air sound happy. Inside, photographs lined the walls. Emma on her first day of school, Rex asleep with his head on Daniel's boot, a candid shot Sarah had taken the day the ruling came through. Daniel watched them, child and dog moving together with unspoken trust, and felt something settle at last. He had lived by structure, by command, by objectives clearly defined. He had believed purpose came from usefulness, from completing tasks under pressure. This was different. There was no endpoint here, no completion report, only presence. Emma stumbled, laughing, and Rex stopped instantly, turning back to nudge her upright. She hugged him around the neck, fearless. Daniel smiled. The most important mission of his life had not been assigned. It had arrived quietly, in the snow, guided by a canine who trusted instinct and a child who needed someone to stay. And for the first time, Daniel Brooks understood that staying was not the absence of courage, it was its truest form. Sometimes miracles don't arrive with thunder or light from the sky. Sometimes they come quietly, through a decision to stay, a hand that refuses to let go, or a heart that chooses love when walking away would be easier. Maybe God doesn't always change our circumstances in an instant. Maybe He places the right people in the right moment, trusting that love, patience, and faith will do the rest. In our everyday lives, we may never face a courtroom or a life or death choice, but we are given smaller chances every day to show up, to protect, to care, to believe that kindness still matters. Those choices, repeated over time, are where real miracles are born. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who might need hope today. Leave a comment and tell us what part moved you the most, and where in the world you are watching from. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so more stories like this can reach those who need them. May God bless you, watch over your family, and fill your life with peace, strength, and quiet miracles you may not even notice, until one day you realize they were there all along.